The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Patterson estate, casting golden light across the polished marble floors. Margaret Wilson stood in her orange and white uniform, yellow cleaning gloves on her hands, preparing for another day's work in the grand mansion. She had been cleaning houses for 30 years now. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, her posture straight despite the long hours. At 52, Margaret carried herself with quiet dignity, though life had not been kind to her. Robert Patterson stood near the window in his navy blue suit, cradling his 18-month-old son, Daniel. The little boy had curly brown hair and wide, innocent eyes. Behind them, guests in elegant navy gowns held champagne glasses, celebrating Daniel's upcoming second birthday party they were planning. Robert was a successful businessman, recently widowed. His wife had passed away just 6 months earlier, leaving him to raise Daniel alone. The grand estate felt emptier now, despite all the staff and the constant business associates coming and going. Margaret had been hired only 2 weeks before. She arrived early each morning, worked quietly, and left promptly at 5. She never spoke unless spoken to, never asked for anything extra. Robert had barely noticed her, honestly. She was just another member of the household staff. But on this particular morning, something changed. Daniel had been fussy all week. The nanny had tried everything: songs, toys, bottles of warm milk. Nothing seemed to comfort the little boy. He cried through the nights, leaving Robert exhausted and worried. Was his son sick? Did he miss his mother? The pediatrician found nothing wrong, but a father knows when his child is suffering. As Margaret entered the main hall with her cleaning supplies, Daniel suddenly stopped crying. The silence was so abrupt that Robert looked up in surprise. The little boy's eyes had locked onto Margaret, and his tiny hand reached out toward her. Then Daniel did something he had never done before. He spoke. "Mama," the little boy whispered, tears streaming down his chubby cheeks. "Mama." The word hung in the air like a bell's echo. Robert froze. The guests fell silent. Their champagne glasses paused halfway to their lips. Margaret stood perfectly still, her yellow-gloved hands trembling slightly. "Mama," Daniel said again, more insistently now, reaching both arms toward the maid. Robert felt his throat tighten. His first instinct was anger. How dare this child confuse a stranger for his mother? But when he looked at Daniel's face, he saw something he hadn't seen in months: peace. The troubled expression that had worried him for weeks had melted away. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She took a small step backward, as if trying to disappear into the walls. "I'm sorry, Mr. Patterson," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her emotion. I'll come back later to clean." But Daniel began to wail. Not the fussy crying of before, but deep, heartbroken sobs. His little body shook with the force of it. Robert tried to comfort him, bouncing him gently, but Daniel only cried harder, his arms still reaching toward Margaret. Robert looked at the maid. Really looked at her for the first time. She was about the same height as his late wife, the same dark hair. But it was more than that. There was something in her eyes, a profound sadness mixed with tremendous kindness. "Please," Robert heard himself say. "Don't go." Margaret hesitated. One of the guests whispered something to another. Margaret could feel their judgment, their surprise at this awkward moment disrupting their elegant gathering. "Would you—" Robert's voice was rough. "Would you mind holding him? Just for a moment?" Margaret glanced at the watching guests, then back at the crying child. Slowly, she removed her yellow gloves and set them aside. She approached carefully, and Robert placed Daniel in her arms. The transformation was immediate. Daniel nestled against her shoulder, his crying softening to quiet hiccups. He wrapped his small fingers around a strand of her dark hair, just as he used to do with his mother. Within moments he was calm, his eyes growing heavy with the sleep that had eluded him for days. Robert watched, his heart breaking and healing at the same time. The room remained silent. Even the chandelier seemed to hold its light more gently. "I had a son," Margaret whispered so quietly that only Robert could hear. He would have been about Daniel's age now. Robert understood immediately, the sadness in her eyes, the tenderness in the way she held his son. "Would have been?" "He was born premature. Lived only 3 days." Margaret's voice was barely audible. "That was 15 months ago. My husband, he couldn't handle the grief. He left, I lost them both. I'm so sorry, Robert said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. And I'm sorry for your loss, too. Mr. Patterson, Margaret replied, gently rocking the now sleeping Daniel. I saw the photographs. Your wife was beautiful. I imagine losing her has been very hard. They stood there together. Two people united by loss, by love, by the strange and mysterious ways that grief connects us to one another. One of the guests cleared her throat uncomfortably. Robert, perhaps we should continue with the party planning. But Robert shook his head. I think we'll reschedule. Thank you all for coming. The guests left, their whispers following them out the door. Robert didn't care. He was watching his son sleep peacefully for the first time in months, held by a woman who understood loss in a way no one else in that house could. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the Patterson household. Margaret still arrived at 7 each morning in her orange and white uniform, still cleaned the grand rooms with care. But now Robert asked her to spend time with Daniel during her breaks. The little boy's face would light up whenever she entered a room. Margaret would sit on the floor with Daniel, building towers of blocks, reading simple picture books in her calm, gentle voice. She taught him to clap his hands to nursery rhymes. She showed him how to be gentle with the estate's old golden retriever. And Daniel thrived. The troubled expression disappeared completely. He began sleeping through the night. His appetite returned. He started saying new words, cookie, doggy, book, though Mama remained reserved for Margaret alone. Robert knew he should probably correct this. Explain to his son the difference between a mother and a nanny, between family and staff. But every time he tried, he thought of Margaret's story, of the baby she had lost, of the comfort she clearly found in caring for Daniel. And he thought of his own loneliness, the empty bed, the silent dinners, the weight of raising a child alone in this vast, echoing house. One evening, about 3 months after that first morning, Robert found Margaret in the garden. Daniel was napping, and she was sitting on a bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Do you mind if I join you? He asked. Of course not, Mr. Patterson. Please call me Robert. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The air smelled of roses and freshly cut grass. I want to talk to you about something, Robert finally said. About Daniel, about the arrangement we have. Margaret stiffened slightly. If this is about him calling me Mama, I can work on correcting. No, Robert interrupted gently. That's not it at all. Margaret, I've been thinking what Daniel did that first morning, recognizing something in you that he needed. It wasn't wrong. It was a gift in a way, for both of you. Margaret turned to look at him, confusion in her dark eyes. I'd like to offer you a different position, Robert continued. Not as a maid, but as Daniel's nanny, full-time. With a proper salary, of course, and your own quarters in the East Wing. You'd be part of the family in the ways that matter. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. Robert, I don't know what to say. Say yes, he said simply. Daniel needs you. And I think if you'll forgive me for saying so, you need him too. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I would be honored. And so Margaret became more than a maid. She became Daniel's nanny, his caregiver, his comfort. The orange and white uniform was replaced with regular clothes. The yellow cleaning gloves were put away for good. But something else was happening too. Robert found himself seeking out Margaret's company in the evenings after Daniel was asleep. They would talk about their lost loved ones, about grief, about learning to live again. They would discuss Daniel's milestones, share stories from their pasts, laugh at the little boy's funny habits. On Daniel's second birthday, they held a small celebration. Just the three of them, a homemade cake that Margaret baked, and a pile of simple toys. Daniel sat between them, frosting on his nose, giggling with pure joy. Robert looked at Margaret across the table. She was helping Daniel open a present, her face alight with happiness. And Robert realized something that took his breath away. He was falling in love with her. Not because she reminded him of his late wife. She didn't, really. They were different women entirely. But Margaret had brought something back into his house that had been missing: warmth, gentleness, the sound of genuine laughter. It was too soon, he told himself. Too complicated. What would people say? But then he looked at his son, healthy and happy, calling Margaret Mama without any confusion in his heart about love or family. Children understand things that adults forget. Love isn't about rules or timelines or what society expects. Love is about who shows up, who stays, who makes the crying stop and the healing begin. 6 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Robert asked Margaret to marry him. They were in the garden again, watching Daniel chase butterflies across the lawn. "This isn't because of Daniel," Robert said carefully. "I mean, he's part of it, of course. But Margaret, I love you, for yourself, for who you are, for the way you've brought this house back to life." Margaret looked at him with those deep, knowing eyes. "Are you sure, Robert? People will talk. They'll say I was just the maid, that this is inappropriate." "Let them talk," Robert said. "I'm sure. The question is, are you?" Margaret watched Daniel tumble onto the grass, laughing at nothing and everything. She thought about the baby she had lost, the grief that had nearly destroyed her, the emptiness that had filled her days, and she thought about this unexpected second chance at family, at love, at motherhood. "I'm sure," she said. They were married quietly that fall. No grand celebration, no society pages. Just a simple ceremony with a few close friends and a little boy who served as ring-bearer, proudly carrying the cushion down the aisle. Daniel was 3 years old now, chattering constantly, asking endless questions about everything. He called Margaret Mama and Robert Daddy, and if anyone asked, they explained honestly that families are made in all kinds of ways, and love is what makes them real. Sometimes in the evening, when Daniel was asleep and the house was quiet, Robert and Margaret would sit together in the same garden, where everything had changed. They would hold hands and talk about their first loves, keeping those memories alive and honored. They would acknowledge the pain that had brought them together, the losses that had shaped them. But mostly they would talk about gratitude, for second chances, for unexpected connections, for a little boy whose first word broke everyone's heart and then healed it. Because Daniel had seen something the adults had missed. He had recognized not a replacement for his mother, but someone who needed mothering as much as he needed a mother, someone whose broken heart matched his own, someone who could help both of them learn to be whole again. Margaret often thought about that first morning, standing in her orange and white uniform, yellow gloves on her hands, prepared for another day of invisible work. She had been so lost then, going through the motions of living without really being alive. And then a child had called her Mama, not because she looked like his mother, not because she was his mother, but because he sensed in her what we all need, someone to hold us when we cry, someone to make us feel safe, someone to love us through the darkness until we find the light again. The yellow gloves were still in a drawer somewhere in the estate. Margaret kept them as a reminder, not of servitude, but of transformation, of how quickly life can change when we're open to love in its unexpected forms. Daniel would never remember that first morning, but Robert and Margaret would never forget it. It was the moment when everything began, the healing, the family, the future they built together one gentle day at a time. And sometimes late at night, when Margaret looked in on her sleeping son, she would whisper a thank you to the universe, to fate, to whatever force had brought them together. She had lost one child and somehow, miraculously, had been given another. Not to replace what was lost. That could never be, but to prove that the human heart's capacity for love is infinite. We never know when grace will arrive. We never know when a broken heart will find its missing piece. We only know that we must stay open, stay kind, stay willing to be surprised by the ways that love finds us. Even in the form of a crying child reaching for a stranger in yellow gloves, calling her Mama, and teaching everyone watching what they had forgotten. That family isn't about blood or rules or what makes sense. Family is about who stays, who loves, who shows up when everything is falling apart and helps put it back together again. And in that grand estate, with its crystal chandeliers and marble floors, 3 people who had lost everything found each other. They built a family on the foundation of shared grief, gentle kindness, and the simple but profound truth that love, real love, always recognizes itself even in the eyes of a child, too young to understand anything, except the wisdom of his own tender heart.